Resolution 954, I call up the bill H.R. 4760, the Securing America's Future Act, and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4760, a bill to amend the immigration laws and the Homeland Security laws and for other purposes.
Pursuant to House Resolution 954, the amendments printed in House Report 115-772 are adopted, and the bill as amended is considered read. The bill as amended shall be debatable for 1 hour, with 40 minutes equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary, and 20 minutes equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Homeland Security. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, each will control 20 minutes. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, and the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, each will control 10 minutes. The House will be in order. Please remove your conversations from the floor. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on H.R. 4760.
Without objection. The gentleman is recognized.
Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I introduced H.R. 4760 along with Michael McCall, Martha McSally, and Raul Labrador to provide an equitable and permanent legal status for unlawful aliens who grew up in America after their parents brought them here as children. Just as importantly, we want to strengthen our borders, close gaping loopholes, curtail endemic fraud, and enhance interior immigration enforcement so that our nation won't face the same dilemma in a few years. President Trump did the right thing and tried to end President Obama's blatantly unconstitutional DACA program. As a federal court ruled in enjoining DACA's sister program, DHS cannot enact a program whereby it not only ignores the dictates of Congress, but actively acts to thwart them. The DHS secretary is not just rewriting the laws, he is creating them from scratch, end quote. President Trump also did the right thing by immediately turning to us, asking Congress to fix the problem. He asked for H.R. 4760. As he asked for, H.R. 4760 solves the DACA conundrum. It provides DACA beneficiaries with an indefinitely renewable legal non-immigrant status, allowing them to live and work in the United States without worry and travel abroad as they choose. It also allows them to receive green cards on the same terms as any other intending immigrant around the world. As I indicated, the bill will help ensure that the distressing DACA dilemma does not recur. It ends catch and release at the border, battles asylum fraud, and ensures that unaccompanied minors caught at the border will be treated equally regardless of their home country. It will ensure that the law no longer tempts minors and their parents to make the dangerous, illicit journey to the United States and to line the pockets of cancerous cartels with hundreds of millions of dollars. The bill will also take away the other magnet that draws millions of persons to come to the U.S. illegally, the jobs magnet. Through the inclusion of Lamar Smith's Legal Workforce Act, it makes E-Verify mandatory. After 2 decades of constant improvement, E-Verify has become an extremely effective, reliable, and easy way for employers to ensure that they have hired a legal workforce. 750,000 employers currently use E-Verify, which almost instantaneously confirms the work eligibility of new hires 99% of the time. The bill will also allow DHS to deport members of MS-13 and other virulent criminal gangs and allow it to detain dangerous aliens who cannot be removed. It will combat the public safety menace of sanctuary cities in multiple ways, including by allowing the Justice Department to withhold from them law enforcement grants. The bill makes significant reforms to our legal immigration system. It puts an end to extended family chain migration and terminates the diversity visa green card lottery, which awards green cards at random to people with no ties to the United States or any particular skills. In addition, it replaces the dysfunctional H-2A agricultural guest worker program. The H-2A program is slow, bureaucratic, and frustrating, often forcing growers to leave crops to rot in the fields. They also must pay an artificially inflated wage rate, along with providing free housing and transportation. In doing the right thing, H-2A users are almost always repaid by being placed at a competitive disadvantage in the marketplace. The bill provides growers with streamlined access to guest workers when sufficient American labor cannot be found. It finally provides dairies and food processors with year-round labor needs with access to a guest worker program. It avoids the pitfalls of the H-2A program, and it will remain at its core a true guest worker program. As growers learned the hard way after the 1986 amnesty, illegal farm workers will leave en masse and flock to the cities when provided with permanent residence. The Agricultural Guest Worker Act contained in this bill is supported by the American Farm Bureau Federation and the dairy industry and over 200 distinct agricultural organizations from across the United States. Following introduction of this legislation, I have sat down with my colleagues for months to learn of any concerns to strive to improve the bill. The product of this intensive work is better legislation. While I am disappointed that the rule did not allow me to include all the improvements made possible by the input of so many members, I am gratified that I could include the refinements to the H-2C Agricultural Guest Worker Program. To give just one example, the bill now clarifies that the Department of Homeland Security will issue documents to unlawful alien farm workers who have been sponsored by growers to join the program, authorizing them to return to the U.S. without the need for visas after completing their initial touchbacks. This will create certainty for growers, allowing them to receive pre-approval of their H-2C petitions for current workers before they leave the country, and pre-certification of the workers' admission back into the U.S. before they leave. Congress has a unique opportunity to act before the country ends up with another large population of who crossed the border illegally as children. Let's take this historic moment to come together and support vital legislation that provides common sense, reasonable solutions. I urge my colleagues to join President Trump and support H.R. 4760. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 3 minutes.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I strongly oppose H.R. 4760. This legislation is nothing more than a wish list of the far-right anti-immigrant fringe. It would do nothing to solve the real problems plaguing our immigration system while causing untold suffering for millions of people. The world has watched President Trump create a family separation crisis out of thin air. I personally met with fathers whose children have been ripped from their arms, who have no idea when or if they will ever see their children again. One father I spoke to was promised he would be kept with his young child, only to have officers enter his room in the middle of the night and forcibly take away his young daughter. We have all seen the anguished faces of the parents separated from their children and listened to the desperate cries of sobbing children screaming for their parents. This is government-sponsored child abuse. This bill does absolutely nothing to solve the crisis. The President, after falsely claiming that he had no choice but to enact this cruel and brutal policy, now says he will end it, proving that he and his administration were lying all along. But it is not clear that yesterday's executive order immediately ends family separation. It also puts our country on a dangerous path of prolonged detention for parents and children. The Keeping Families Together Act, which I introduced this week, along with virtually every Democratic member, would actually prevent children from being separated from their parents, except in extraordinary circumstances. We could vote on that legislation today, but instead, we have this bill before us now. This bill turns all undocumented immigrants into criminals. It takes particular aim at families, children, workers, businesses, public safety, and our fundamental values as a nation, all at once. It is almost impressive how many bad ideas have been crammed into one comprehensive package. For example, it eliminates most visa categories that promote family reunification, as well as the diversity visa program, which provides residents of many countries the only method of immigrating to the United States. It removes critical protections for unaccompanied children, and it does away with other important safeguards for children traveling with their parents. It would decimate the agriculture industry by requiring employers to use the E-Verify employment verification system without fixing the underlying immigration system. And it would undercut American workers by importing guest workers at drastically depressed wages. It would also undermine our asylum system, breaking with our proud tradition of being a beacon of hope and freedom for the oppressed. In exchange for all these harsh anti-immigrant provisions, it offers the most minimal protection to dreamers, creating a renewable temporary status with no path to citizenship, leaving them in perpetual limbo, unable to become full members of society in the only country they have ever known. This is an act of extortion we cannot abide. This bill fails to repair our broken immigration system, and indeed in many ways makes it even worse, and all without substantially helping the dreamers. I urge my colleagues to reject this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the President. The gentleman from Virginia.
I did not.
Nice.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith, who is the author of an important provision in this bill related to electronic verification of employment, and he's the former chairman of the House Judiciary Committee.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me thank the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte, for all that he has done to advance immigration reform during this Congress. And I do support H.R. 4760, Securing America's Future Act. This legislation ensures that our immigration policies put the interest of Americans first. We need to thank not only Chairman Goodlatte, but others who have put so much time and effort into this legislation. We appreciate Mr. Goodlatte's diligence, expertise, and commitment to improving our immigration system. Any immigration reform considered by Congress must, at a minimum, secure our borders, implement workforce verification to end the illegal jobs magnet, reduce chain migration, bolster interior enforcement, and prevent abuse of our asylum laws. Securing America's Future Act includes all of these necessary provisions. And the bill delivers on the President's pledge to voters to complete physical barriers along our southern border, penalize lawless sanctuary cities, and end the Obama administration's catch-and-release policy that returns dangerous criminal immigrants to our streets to prey on innocent Americans. Of special interest to me is the inclusion of the Legal Workforce Act in the bill, which requires all new employees' work eligibility to be verified. This will reduce illegal immigration and save jobs for American workers. Also important is the deadline to finally implement an entry-exit tracking system to identify visa overstayers. They comprise half of the almost 1 million new illegal immigrants every year. Securing America's Future Act helps keep our communities safe and protects American workers. It deserves our enthusiastic support. And again, I want to thank Chairman Goodlatte for offering this legislation, and I'll yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Chairperson, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee, Ms. Lofgren.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Madam Chair, this is an anti-immigrant bill. It slashes legal immigration. It will injure the ag industry. It criminalizes nearly the entire undocumented population. will undermine public safety, and removes critical protections for families and children, and it even fails to provide a pathway to legal permanent residence for dreamers. You know, sometimes my friends across the aisle say the problem with the immigration is we don't have assimilation. You don't get assimilation when you create a permanent underclass of people who are Americans in every way but their paperwork. It eliminates family-based categories, and this is the relatives of Americans, American citizens and legal permanent residents. Forget it, you're not going to be able to get your family members in if this bill passes. It mandates the use of E-Verify, which would be highly disruptive to restaurants, hotels, and other industries. And the changes in the ag worker provision are just a fig leaf. The bill transforms a civil law violation into a crime so that undocumented immigrants, including the parents of dreamers the bill purports to help, become criminals overnight. It would accelerate separation of kids from parents when 11 million American workers suddenly become subject to prosecution. Undermining our asylum system by establishing impossibly high evidentiary burdens. It removes protections, as I've said, and it does nothing to reunite the thousands of children who've been taken away from their parents at the border. Instead, it facilitates putting mothers in the cages with their toddlers. So why are we debating a bill that nearly everyone, even many in the Republican Party, think is a terrible idea? I fear it's because the very extreme elements of the Republican Party have become the loudest and the most powerful. I continue to have faith in the good people of our country. The American people spoke out loudly against President Trump's family separation policy. They couldn't stand seeing little children, babies, and toddlers ripped from their mother's arms. And we saw a reversal, but it is not a solution, because locking up mothers, putting those mothers in the cages with their toddlers, is not the solution to this problem. We're not going to let hatred, bigotry, and xenophobia prevail in this country. I would urge a no vote on this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Chairman, I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Gutierrez.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 3 minutes.
The re-election strategy for every single Republican member of the House is to stand strong, with a president willing to take children from their parents in order to look mean and nasty and cruel to children who are fleeing for their lives. You own that. That is your campaign strategy. As of today, Republicans want to put the children in the same jails as the parents and fight to hold them indefinitely and demand we charge asylum seekers as criminals and jail them with their children. The more than 2,300 children who have been taken from their parents and put in a vast system spread over thousands of miles. We just don't know if those children will ever see their families again. You own that too. That is what you are campaigning on to save your jobs this coming November. Taking DACA away from dreamers, that's your policy too. And then putting bills on the floor to cut legal immigration and build a wall are your strategies to blame Democrats for what you are doing. Republicans want to be both the arsonists and the firefighters, and you can't be both. I don't blame Speaker Ryan and Chairman Goodlatte. They're not bad people. They are both decent men of faith who have been put in a position of defending policies that are cruel, inhumane, and run deeply contrary to the will of the American people and the values of our nation. This must be morally wrenching for them, but honestly, I have little sympathy. Each has made a devil's bargain to trade their reputation for Stephen Miller's agenda and Donald Trump's name. Legal immigration? No. An asylum policy that protects human lives? No. DACA to protect dreamers? No. Policies that treat wife-beating, rape, and human trafficking as matters that require us to protect women? No. A nation of immigrants? No. All they want is a wall. even though both are leaving office because the Republican Party is no longer home for decent men and women of values, faith, and conscience, both are leaving us with one last commitment: to put the needs of this erratic president above the will of the people and above the good of our nation. At some point, someone needs to stop complimenting the emperor on his new set of clothes and start telling the president he's naked, covering his rear end from all the lies, the deceit, and the soullessness is no longer sustainable.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president and to direct their remarks to the chair. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as may consume to respond to some of the false charges that we're hearing here. First of all, with regard to E-Verify, unfortunately, there's a misconception that it's our intention to implement the new H2C program and mandate E-Verify for agriculture simultaneously. This could not be further from the truth. The Ag Act, under that act, E-Verify will not be mandated for agriculture until the H2C is properly up and running, and no sooner than 24 months after enactment of the legislation. In addition, E-Verify will only apply to future hires. Secondly, I want to respond to those who complain about what we're doing for the DACA recipients in this legislation. And I want to make it very, very clear. We're going to do something that's legal, something that's constitutional for them, instead of something that was illegal and unconstitutional, and it's going to be superior in this bill to what was done for them there, because they'll be allowed to remain in the United States permanently, renewing every 3 years, only excluded if they do not meet certain criteria. And the fact of the matter is, we will have an opportunity for them to avail themselves of existing pathways to citizenship. So if they're married to a United States citizen, as it would be logical that a great many of these DACA recipients are, because of the fact that they've grown up here, they will be able to benefit from that. They could not do that under the Obama executive order. So this is much better than how the Democrats have treated the DACA recipients. Secondly, under the agricultural workforce, the status quo is sustainable for American agriculture. Whether the labor workforce status quo is sustainable for American agriculture. Under current law in California and other states, farmers are facing chronic employee shortages. Last fall, the California Farm Bureau announced the results of an informal survey of its members. The survey showed that 69% of those surveyed were experiencing labor shortfalls. Despite all the efforts California farmers and ranchers have made to find and hire people to work on their operations, they still can't find enough willing and qualified employees. California Farm Bureau President Paul Wenger said farmers have offered higher wages, benefits, and more year-round jobs. They have tried to mechanize operations where possible and have even changed crops or left ground idle, but employee shortages persist. The labor force status quo is simply unsustainable for American agriculture. Clearly, this is not a situation that is going to be solved by granting permanent resident status to farm workers. In fact, that is the opposite of what's needed. Granting permanent resident status to illegal farm workers will not do anything to ensure that farmers and ranchers have access to the labor they need for years to come. It is short-sighted and does nothing to relieve employers of legal farm workers of the unnecessary burdens and competitive disadvantage they face under the outdated H-2A program. Americans' food can be grown in other countries where land and labor are far cheaper. To ensure that our meat and produce continue to be grown in America and that our nation's agricultural industry thrives in the global marketplace, the U.S. needs a flexible, workable, and fair guest worker program like the H-2C program established in the Ag Act and contained in the legislation that we are debating right now. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Chairperson, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 1 minute.
Let me thank the gentleman for the time. I urge my colleagues to stand in full opposition to Securing America's Future Act, the 4760, H.R. 4760. First of all, let me say that the only thing that the president's executive order shows is that he is willing to rip families apart unless it costs him politically. If there's a political price to pay, then he'll back up and try to confuse what's really going on. But at the end of the day, this zero tolerance policy is absolutely wrong, and we have to end it now. You know, making unlawful presence a crime is probably a violation of international law. This bill makes it difficult, makes it impossible for people who are seeking asylum to come here and try to get their cases adjudicated. They're running, in many cases, from the most abominable situations imaginable. People should know that America is the kind of place you can come to if you are seeking refuge. Let me also say that this thing to build this wall, we will never allow that. We will never agree to that, and we will oppose it with everything we have, because it is a symbol of hate and division. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Madam Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining on each side?
The gentleman from Virginia has 8 minutes. The gentleman from New York has 11 minutes.
I'll reserve.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
California, right? I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the distinguished gentleman from New York, Congressman Nadler, for this opportunity to speak on this bill. Mr. Speaker, I was hired to work across the aisle, to come to Washington to get things done, to fix problems. And earlier this month, we had a discharge petition that we needed 2 more signatures that would have given us the opportunity here on this floor to vote on 4 immigration bills under the Queen of the Hill rule. And essentially that means that whatever bill gets more votes moves ahead. And among those 4 bills was Mr. Goodlatte's bill. And of course, also one of those bills was the Aguilar-Hurd bill. That was a product of both Democrats and Republicans coming together, working on a solution. Unfortunately, we weren't given the opportunity to vote on all these 4 bills. And the current bill on the floor today does not offer a pathway to citizenship for Dreamers. And of course, it does not address the current problem of reuniting children who are separated from their families. And I ask today my colleagues, please reject this legislation. And I ask the Speaker, give us the opportunity to vote on the Aguilar-Hurd bill. Mr. Speaker, thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Labrador, the chairman of the Immigration and Border Security Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee.
The gentleman from Idaho is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in strong support of H.R. 4760, the Securing America's Future Act. This bill provides the tools needed to enforce our immigration laws, secure our borders, and begin the process of reforming our legal immigration system, while also ensuring a generous protection for DACA recipients. Enforcement remains the key to our system. Without enforcement, our laws have little effect. This bill targets criminal gangs, dangerous aliens, and the sanctuary policies that allow these public safety threats to thrive. The bill also provides a permanent solution for DACA recipients. They can apply to receive a 3-year indefinitely renewable visa so they can live and work in the United States forever, as long as they abide by the laws. This permanent status gives DACA recipients more surety than President Obama's temporary program ever did. The bill will finally make good on our commitment to grant our growers and other workers a workable agricultural guest worker program. The lack of a reliable source of labor when American workforce are simply not available is imperiling the future of American agriculture. The bill's H-2C program will be a true guest worker program that will allow the current agricultural workforce to participate on the same terms and conditions as any other worker around the world. The program is endorsed by the American Farm Bureau. It is a critical part of this bill. Finally, it closes the loopholes that have allowed fraud to destroy the integrity of our asylum system. by raising the credible fear standard and sending a clear message that fraud and frivolity will not be tolerated in the United States. This is a good bill, and I encourage every member to support it. I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence.
Gentlewoman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Ms. Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to H.R. 4760, the Securing America's Future Act. Instead of working in a bipartisan matter like open rules committee hearings, members of this body now must vote on 2 bills that will hurt immigrant families and communities by worsening the family separation crisis on the border and funding the divisive border wall. H.R. 7060 is a hardline anti-immigration bill that fails to provide permanent path of citizenship for our dreamers. It makes family reunification much more difficult. It provides $25 billion for the Trump wall. This is why we're going to be confronted with a farm bill that cuts food for starving and poor children in America. It would expand the family separation and harms children. Ms. Speaker, this is not the America I know. This bill is nothing more than an attempt to appease administration and the most extreme fraction of the
gentlewoman's time is
Republican
expired.
Party. I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time is expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is
Madam Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the ranking member of the Crime Subcommittee, the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
You said 2 minutes. From Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the distinguished gentleman for yielding. And it certainly saddens me to have to come and to call legislation harsh and cruel. For if there's anything that we should do in a bipartisan or frankly nonpartisan manner, it should be the complement to the Statute of Liberty, which over the centuries has been the standard bearer of the values and virtues of this nation. I'm saddened that we have come to a point, having worked on the Judiciary Committee with outstanding leaders like my ranking member, my chairman, the subcommittee ranking, Ms. Loughran, for many years on real immigration reform, here we are today. Let me tell you why I'm opposed to this. It may be because I represent Americans. Americans who are in the 18th Congressional District in Texas. It may be because we're one of the most diverse cities. My mayor says the diverse city in the nation. It may be that we have South Asians and Haitians. We have people from Eastern Europe. We have those, of course, that are Latino. We have those from the Caribbean and Africans, and many, many more. We have those from Europe. And here's what this bill will do. It will quash any opportunity for mom and dad to bring in extended family members, citizen mom and dad to bring in their family members. It ends legal immigration on what we have called the values of America, family reunification. At the same time, the ugly name that has been given to diversity visas is not true. Those who come through the diversity visa for small countries, should we discriminate against small countries, have the highest level of education and go into medicine and science and try to help. And then there is no relief for DACA. People who are military, paramedics, lawyers, teachers, we're dependent upon them, having grown up here, loving this nation, pledging the flag, pledging to the United States flag. And
the gentlewoman's time has expired.
It is a sin and a shame that we have an administration.
Madam Chairperson.
The gentlewoman's time has expired.
Madam Chairperson, I yield the gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
The gentlewoman's recognized for 30 seconds.
I thank the kind gentleman. And then as we have not done anything for DACA, we have not done anything for the children snatched away from their families. The children that I saw for 2 days in the border at Texas, Roger, who I held in my hand, maybe the 2-year-old like this, because what it does is it does nothing to reunite the children. It does nothing after 20 days to be able to protect them, because the fake executive order does not go beyond 20 days. And frankly, we don't know where the 2,000 children are, and I know the values of the faith community in America are to reunite. I am saddened that we have a bill. I ask my colleague to oppose this bill, and I yield back my time.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the pending legislation before us. I believe it's very important that we show that we do want to address this issue, and I think the Goodlatte-McCall bill does that in a humane way. Now we have this issue of separation of children that's arisen at the border just in the last week or so. The Trump policy is not any different on paper than the Obama policy was. What is different is the way it's been covered, and President Trump has realized that something needs to be done differently and has signed an executive order yesterday to that effect. I personally think that we ought to go back to the original policy where if you wanted political asylum, you applied at the embassy or the consulate in your home country. And if you bring your children and you march them across the deserts of Mexico and you bring them all the way to the Texas border, you do get a court hearing, but I would say we give that court hearing back in their country of origin. And if we have to send them back at taxpayer expense, we deduct the cost from existing aid packages that we're giving to those home countries. That way they don't have to come all the way to the Texas border or the California border or the Arizona border or the New Mexico border. In order to get their day in court. They wait in their home country, and then they get their day in court there. Nobody wants to separate families, but it is the parents who bring the children with them. It's not the United States government that's forcing those parents to try to come into this country illegally and bring their children. The Goodlatte bill funds border security. It begins to solve some of the issues of the lottery system. I personally think it's much better to have a merit-based immigration system than a lottery system where you just happen to, luck of the draw, get a come into the United States card. I think this is a good piece of legislation, and I hope we pass it this afternoon.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I thank the chairman.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, how much time is remaining, please?
The gentleman from New York has 6½ minutes remaining.
6½? And the other side?
The gentleman from Virginia has 4 minutes remaining.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise today in strong opposition to this cruel anti-immigrant bill. This bill is so bad they even want to destroy legal immigration to this country. For decades, our immigration laws were discriminatory, favoring Nordic and Western Europeans, restricting Italians and Jews, and banning the Chinese completely. Finally, in 1965, during the Civil Rights era, Senator Ted Kennedy ushered in a fair immigration system based on family reunification. Because this system brings families together, immigrant households are less likely to rely on public benefits, and immigrants are also buying homes and starting businesses at a faster rate. But now, with this bill, Republicans are trying to undo that progress and make America white again. Worse, they're tearing families apart to do this. While Trump and Republicans are ripping parents from children at the border, they're trying to do the same through our immigration laws. This war on families must stop.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, this afternoon the U.S. Chamber of Commerce sent an alert to members of Congress that says the cuts to legal immigration in this bill are bad news for states. And I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to the Securing America's Future Act. It is obscene to bring this deeply flawed bill to the floor when thousands of children have been ripped from their parents. Americans across the country are outraged over the Trump administration's actions to separate families at the border. And Trump's answer? An executive order that cages families indefinitely and will be immediately challenged in court. Unfortunately, this bill before us would do nothing to stop any of this. Instead, it criminalizes every undocumented man, woman, and child in this country and subjects them to the same cruel policy being played out at our border. It is shocking we're even considering this bill. Let's be on the right side of history. Let's stop tearing families apart. Let's stop caging people fleeing violence. I urge my colleagues to do the right thing and defeat this repugnant bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia reserves.
I continue to reserve.
And the gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our ranking member for yielding and for your tireless advocacy. I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 4760. This is an anti-immigrant bill, plain and simple. It fails to provide a pathway to citizenship for dreamers. It dismantles family immigration. It ends the important diversity visa lottery program. It funds $30 billion for Trump's border wall, and it fails to address the horrible zero-tolerance policy. Why are we moving forward with a bill that does not address the malicious detention of families seeking asylum? A bill that does nothing to reunite the 2,300 children separated from their parents. These policies are really a disgrace and a stain on our country. Just imagine the horrors of these families fleeing violence, domestic abuse. But we're not providing refugees. No, our government has been ripping children out of the arms of parents. We're holding kids in cages. And now the Trump administration wants to leave whole families, including young children, in jail for extended periods of time. Locking up kids is child abuse. It's a violation of their human rights. We must ensure that these children are reunited with their families. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill. And as my colleague, Congresswoman Chu, said, it is about making America white again.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Chairperson, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. This bill does many things, but the one thing that it does not do is heal the wound in the soul of America. It does not provide a pathway for these babies to return home to their parents. This bill is about as bad as it can get if you care about what you see in this picture. Children should not become the tools of the trade for politicians. This bill will legitimize children as the tools of the trade. We cannot pass it. We should not pass it. We must rethink what we're doing to this country. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
How much time has each side got, Mr. Speaker?
The gentleman from New York has 2.5 minutes. The gentleman from Virginia has 4 minutes.
I yield now 1.5 minutes to the distinguished ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee, Ms. Lofgren.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this bill is a step in the wrong direction in so many ways. I wish that we had had an opportunity to sit down, reason together, and come up with a plan that really serves our country. That didn't happen. Here's what the result was. The Chamber of Commerce has just reported that the Niskanen Center that they have relied on indicates that if this bill became law, the U.S. would lose $319 billion in GDP. That would be the impact, according to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for adopting this bill. And I wonder what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are really doing. By turning every undocumented person in the United States, currently a civil law violation, into a crime, we're now creating 11 million prosecution opportunities. At the same time, the Washington Post is just reporting, and I quote, this is the headline, "Trump administration will stop prosecuting migrant parents who cross the border illegally with children," official says. What are we doing here? We're doing a bill that would incarcerate families and children to pursue a policy that the administration now says they don't intend to pursue. Now, I don't have a lot of trust in the Trump administration because it changes daily, but I will say, if I may have an additional 10 seconds.
I yield an additional 30 seconds to the gentlelady.
Gentlelady is recognized for 30 seconds.
I would urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to take a step back here. Your president has left you out on a limb. He just sawed that limb off for a bill that does damage to the country, for a policy that he now has apparently abandoned. This is a ridiculous situation here, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Virginia.
Speaker, I believe I have the right to close, and I'm the only remaining speaker. So I reserve.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from New York is recognized for 30 seconds.
I'm prepared to close. How much time do I have to?
Gentleman from New York has 30 seconds.
Thank you, I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this bill is a harsh anti-immigrant package that fails to provide a pathway to citizenship for dreamers and that fails to end family separation, while slashing legal immigration, crippling our agriculture industry, criminalizing undocumented immigrants, undermining public safety, and removing critical protections for families and children, all in one monstrous bill. There is no justification for anyone voting for this bill. I urge my colleagues to oppose the legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized. The gentleman from Virginia has 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentleman's recognized.
First of all, this bill has been mischaracterized and was just, again, this bill makes provisions for when the Immigration Service prosecutes somebody at the border. It doesn't tell them when to do that. So it is entirely incorrect to make that assertion. So I see the conflicting news reports about what the intention of the administration is today on that issue. But that does not change the fact that that has nothing to do with the good measures in this bill that correct the problems that we're speaking about. The overwhelming majority of the American people want children to be with their parents, and I've just seen a poll a few minutes ago that shows that the overwhelming majority of them want those children detained with their parents, not to have the parents and the children released into the interior of the country where they never return for their hearing. That kind of open border policy that's supported by the advocates on the other side of the aisle is not good for America, and it is not good for sound immigration policy. We are a nation of immigrants. There's not a person in this room who can't go back a few generations or several generations and find someone in their family who immigrated to the United States. But we are also a nation of laws. And respect for the rule of law and following our legal immigration system is the foundation of our society. So, to me, when you say that it's not good enough to do better for the DACA recipients than Barack Obama did. Where do you get that idea from? When you say that we're not a generous country with regard to immigration and that this is an anti-immigration bill when it sustains far more legal immigration than any other country on earth, they are completely wrong. But at the same time that we do that, and we promote that in this bill, good legal immigration policy and something fair for the DACA recipients, we must also have secure borders in our country. And we must give any administration, not just this one, the tools it needs to close the loopholes, to secure the border, to end crazy programs like the visa lottery program that gives 55,000 green cards to people just based on pure luck. There are better things to do with those green cards, to move to a merit-based immigration system. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation, reject the negative ideas of the opposition, and move forward with a policy that both does something important for the DACA recipients, but also secures America's national security interests and the interests of our citizens. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas will control 10 minutes. The gentleman from Mississippi will control 10 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today because we finally have the opportunity to secure our borders once and for all. Before coming to Congress, I was a counterterrorism prosecutor in the Justice Department. I saw the threats along our border firsthand. After getting elected to the House, the very first bill I introduced put an end to this catch and release system. And here we are in this chamber, 14 years later, and I'm still fighting for it. Doing nothing should not be an option. As I've said before, it is time for Congress to act. Today we have an historic opportunity to fix this problem once and for all with the Securing America's Future Act. Our legislation delivers on the President's 4 pillars, which I worked closely with him on. It secures the border by building a wall, ends chain migration and the diversity lottery, and provides a rational DACA solution. It also deploys new technology and adds boots on the ground. We must move towards a more merit-based system and not a random system. This legislation also provides, Mr. Speaker, a legal solution that will keep families together when they cross the border illegally. Our bill brings a generational change that prevents us from revisiting these problems down the road. But this isn't just about closing loopholes and fixing broken laws. Border security is a national security issue. Violent gangs like MS-13, human traffickers and smugglers sneaking into our country infect our neighborhoods, and too many lives are at risk, and opioids come across the border. Unfortunately, the threats do not stop there. We know that international terrorists are trying to exploit our border. This was made clear from the materials found in bin Laden's compound and from propaganda outlets like Inspire magazine. The 9/11 Commission report even stated that predecessors to al-Qaeda had been exploiting weaknesses in our border security since the 1990s. And in April, Secretary Nielsen testified that ISIS has encouraged its followers to cross our southwest border, given the loopholes that they are also aware of. We must solve this problem, and we must solve it today. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support this bill and give the American people the security that they have long demanded and deserve. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 4760, a bill that doubles down on the President's cruel zero-tolerance policy. This harsh anti-immigrant, anti-American bill is the realization of the President's cruel immigration and border security rhetoric and policies. Remember when the Republican Party used to say it was the party of family values? H.R. 4760 is focused on families, but not in a good way. It is focused on separating families, incarcerating families, and eliminating pathways for family-based immigration. Remember when the Republican Party used to say it was the party of law and order? Well, it does take action with respect to local law enforcement, but not in a good way. It would withhold Homeland Security and other law enforcement grants from so-called sanctuary cities that, for the purpose of public safety, seek to foster trust from immigrant communities. Law enforcement officials across the country oppose this provision because it would make their communities less safe. For example, Latinos in 3 major cities have been reporting fewer crimes since President Trump took office, particularly as it results to domestic violence and sexual assault. Finally, remember when the Republican Party used to say it was the party of fiscal discipline? Well, no more. If enacted, H.R. 4760 would require billions of taxpayers' dollars to be wasted on the President's border wall, which I seem to recall hearing that it would be paid for by the Mexican government. Now, they want the taxpayers of America to pay for it. It's also Wave's pay-go scorecard. So now you pull a hat trick. You spend the money, but you don't score it. So ultimately, it won't show up in our budget numbers. Shame on you. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge a no vote on H.R. 4760 and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the President. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Arizona, the chair of the Subcommittee on Border Security, Ms. McSally.
Gentlelady from Arizona is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your years of hard work on this issue to secure our border. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 4760, the Securing America's Future Act. As one of only 9 members of Congress who represent communities along our southern border, and as the Border Security Subcommittee Chair, I have witnessed firsthand the security threats we face from an unsecure border and the dysfunctions of our immigration system. Since I came to Congress, I've been working passionately to protect Arizonans from the public safety threats that accompany a porous border and to start to fix this dysfunctional immigration system. This bill, which we have been tirelessly working on since September of last year, along with Chairman McCall, Chairman Goodlatte, Congressman Labrador, represents an important step to keep our country safe by securing the border, including building the wall, closing many legal loopholes, ending chain migration, ending the visa lottery, cracking down on sanctuary cities and MS-13 gangs, and providing a legislative solution to the DACA population that is reasonable and fair and doesn't incentivize more illegal activity in the future. This is the first legislation on these topics in the House that President Trump has supported, and we worked very closely with the administration in the process to propose this thoughtful solution to fix these very real and complex security and economic challenges. Like many pieces of legislation, though, this bill is not perfect. And there are many improvements, such as the guaranteed funding mechanism for border security, including the wall, and other technical corrections that we worked on over the last 6 months that I sure would have liked to seen in this version of the bill on the floor. Nonetheless, I strongly support passage of this legislation as the first significant proposal to solve these very serious issues that continue to impact communities in Arizona and the rest of the country. I remain ready to lead and help deliver legislation to the President's desk that he can sign into law. I would urge our colleagues, especially on the other side of the aisle, who say they care about border security and DACA recipients, to not play politics and vote yes on this bill. And I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the retired Chief of Police of Orlando, Florida, the gentlelady from Orlando, Florida.
Gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, during my 27 years in law enforcement, I fought many threats to our families. But today I have to say that I am ashamed that our leaders now say that those families are the threat. Families seeking asylum are not a threat. Toddlers and children at the border are not a threat. Dreamers who are brought here as young children, both of us know, are not a threat. Mr. Speaker, I ask, why is it so easy to reject those who we believe are different from us? We will not allow this administration to make America a country that only accepts the rich and well-connected. When we know better, we are supposed to do better. And so I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, you're right, let's stop playing politics, let's do better and reject this dangerous piece of legislation. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Louisiana, a member of the Homeland Security Committee, Mr. Higgins.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 4760, the Securing America's Future Act of 2018. I'm a co-sponsor of this legislation. I remind all my colleagues that a sovereign nation cannot stand without sovereign borders. I remind my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that we are representatives of citizens of the 50 sovereign states of America. We have not been elected by citizens of Mexico or Nicaragua or El Salvador. We represent American interests. This is an America First bill. It secures America's southern borders. I urge all my colleagues to embrace their oath and to recognize their service to these citizens that depend upon sound, decisive measure from this body. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all recognize the sovereignty of our country, but we also recognize its diversity. And we all are immigrants, so let's get over it. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Rice.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Speaker, it's a shame that we are wasting our time today on two bills that are harmful and hyperpartisan when we all know that the USA Act, introduced by Representatives Aguilar and Hurd, has the votes to pass on this House floor. This bipartisan solution would finally provide our dreamers, college students, veterans, service members, business owners, with the status and certainty that they have long deserved. The USA Act would also effectively secure our borders without wasting taxpayer money on a wall that would not make us any safer. The bills being considered today are simply not what most Americans want. They deny dreamers a path to citizenship, they abandon our obligation to protect those fleeing persecution and violence, and they do nothing to reunite the families who have already been torn apart by the Trump administration. Mr. Speaker, I urge you to do the responsible thing to finally govern and allow the bipartisan USA Act to come to the floor. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Kansas, a member of the Homeland Security Committee, Mr. Estes.
The gentleman from Kansas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 4760, Securing America's Futures Act. Mr. Speaker, our immigration system is broken. For decades, administrations have offered temporary fixes or chosen to not enforce certain provisions of the law. However, the election of President Trump shows a clear desire by the American people to fix our broken immigration system and secure our border. The Securing America's Future Act addresses these issues and provides needed solutions. The bill secures our border by authorizing a wall, providing new border technology, and putting more boots on the ground. The bill refocuses legal immigration on skills that are needed by ending the visa lottery program and chain migration. It also prevents future illegal immigration by mandating E-Verify for employers and cracking down on sanctuary cities. Important for my state of Kansas, this bill includes H-2C agriculture visas to allow people to come to work and provide skills our farmers need. Finally, this bill gives stability to children brought here illegally by providing a renewable legal status as long as recipients pay taxes and obey the law without providing a special path to citizen, because no one should get to jump line. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Houston, Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady from Texas, recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank the distinguished gentleman. I would offer to say that those Guatemalan Americans, El Salvadorian Americans, and those Americans from the country of Mexico and others who serve in the United States military certainly reflect the diversity of this nation. I would offer to say that sadly, this is the image that is America today. It is not the Statue of Liberty. And I stand to oppose this bill because I know as a member of the Homeland Security Committee, we've had a plan that was bipartisan that would provide for border security that included technology and barriers. Now we have succumbed to a process of which every good-thinking person has to oppose, including the business community. Law enforcement opposes this program, in particular this legislation, in particular because it makes communities less safe. Just this week, a Texas sheriff deputy was arrested for sexually assaulting a 4-year-old girl and threatening to deport the undocumented mother if she reported the crime. Good law enforcement officers understand that they need to have people report the crime. We know that it was an immigrant that had and gave us the polio, as well as the researcher and the person who helped us get the polio vaccine. Finally, young people who now are coming to this country snatched away from their parents, unaccompanied youngsters as well, will no longer have the protections of the juvenile, the special immigrant juvenile status. It strips crucial protections for abused, abandoned, and neglected children by limiting their ability to access special immigrant juvenile status. This bill is a bad bill. It is not an immigration bill. It is a bad bill, and it really is not for the American people. I yield back.
Lady's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Arizona, a member of the Homeland Security Committee, the newest one, Mrs. Lesko.
Gentlelady from Arizona is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 4760, the Securing America's Future Act, vital legislation to the state of Arizona. My constituents back home know all too well how desperately we need our border secured. I signed on as a co-sponsor of this bill because it will fund a wall and other protective infrastructure, close the gaping loopholes in our immigration laws, and finally secure our southern border, ending this problem once and for all. It is disappointing that with all the rhetoric coming from my colleagues across the aisle, they still refuse to come to the negotiating table and work towards a legislative solution. Our broken immigration system cannot continue to be ignored. I want to thank Chairman McCall and Goodlatte for their work on this much-needed legislation, and I urge all of my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no further speakers and am prepared to close at this time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers at this time either, and am prepared to close. The gentleman from Mississippi is prepared to close.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as you heard, H.R. 4760 is fatally flawed. We are here only today debating it because the Republican leadership was essentially extorted by extremists within its ranks. Instead, we should be here debating legislation to give dreamers a path to citizenship. We should be here debating legislation to give safe haven to refugees from Haiti, El Salvador, Sudan, and Nicaragua. We should be here debating a measure to end zero tolerance and family separation. Even before the Trump administration created this family separation crisis, America's image was suffering the effects of the Trump slump due to the president's inflammatory and cruel immigration and border security policies and rhetoric. In fact, last June, the Pew Research Center released an international survey that concluded that sentiment regarding the U.S. had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. What the President and supporters of H.R. 4760 do not understand is that what make America great is its people, both native-born and immigrants. Let's send a message to the President that we know what makes America great. Let's defeat H.R. 4760. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of the time.
The gentleman yields back. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging personalities toward the President. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me say this is a historic opportunity to get something done that we probably haven't gotten done in 25 years. But let me first say that I'm a father of 5 children. I've been down to the detention centers and seen these kids down there, these babies. It's one of the most, from a human standpoint, one of the horrible experiences I've had in my lifetime. But let me say this, Mr. Speaker, this bill protects our children. It protects our children because it provides a deterrence for them not to come here in the first place. It also keeps families together and doesn't separate them as current law dictates. Current law dictates this if we don't change the law. And let me also add, I talked to the secretary today, 10,000 of these 12,000 children who are in the detention center came without their parents. That means 10,000 came without their parents. And who were their guardians? The drug traffickers, the smugglers, the coyotes, as they made the dangerous journey from Central America all the way up through Mexico and into the United States. I have seen the horrors of that. And this bill will provide the deterrence to stop that from happening because, as we know, they are abused on the way up. That journey, they are abused physically and sexually and demoralized and recruited. That has to stop. And, Mr. Speaker, this bill will stop that. With that, I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 954, the previous question is ordered on the bill as amended. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
To amend the immigration laws and the Homeland Security laws and for other purposes.
What purpose does the gentlewoman from New Mexico seek recognition?
I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentlewoman opposed to the bill?
I'm opposed in the current form.
The gentlewoman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Ms. Michelle Lujan Grisham of New Mexico moves to recommit the bill, H.R. 4760, to the Committee on the Judiciary with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendment. In Section 1, in the heading, strike Table of Contents.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to dispose of the reading.
Is there objection? Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her motion.
This is the final amendment to the bill, which will not kill the bill or send it back to committee. If adopted, the bill will immediately proceed to final passage as amended. When DACA was terminated in September, this chamber promised hundreds of thousands of young people and the American public that we would have a public debate and a vote to protect dreamers. We gather here today instead to vote on legislation that fails to protect these young people, radically changes our immigration laws, and derails the bipartisan Queen of the Hill effort that would give us a solution. H.R. 4760 is a hyper-partisan, sweeping bill would fundamentally change our legal immigration system and negatively impact our economy, which is why it's opposed by the majority of the Republican conference, faith groups, businesses, chambers, and quite frankly, everyone in between. If enacted, these policies would undermine local law enforcement, hurt businesses, and rip apart communities through mass deportation, while telling hundreds of thousands of American dreamers that they can only be a guest in the country most of them have ever known, but that they will never truly be American. The truth is, this bill is a poison pill-ridden effort that does nothing to get us closer to passing a bipartisan, narrow, targeted solution for dreamers. Congress, that's each and every one of us, has a responsibility to address this Trump-created crisis in a bipartisan, rapid, compassionate, and meaningful way. This is what the American people want us to do. But since the start of the Trump administration, a divisive and twisted narrative has been perpetuated to villainize, scapegoat, and hurt immigrant families. This week, the pain of immigrant families was felt by each and every person in America that heard the terror and cries of children being torn from their parents. This week, we've experienced the horror many immigrant families feel every single day. And we've seen how ugly it is to use vulnerable immigrant children, mothers, and fathers as political pawns. But we've also seen Americans stand up for these families. We saw them rebuke the president and his heinous policy. And today, we must do the same thing by standing up for dreamers. We must meet our responsibility as members of Congress by voting for legislation that fixes this Trump-created DACA crisis, not by voting for legislation that makes it worse. Every time that a bipartisan fix for dreamers is within our reach, this chaotic Republican conference caves to those who aim to exploit dreamers in order to impose radical changes to our immigration system. The provisions in H.R. 470-60's partisan anti-immigrant bill betray our most fundamental American values. It is a reflection of the xenophobic agenda of the Trump White House, which prioritizes billions upon billions on a wasteful wall, cuts legal immigration, and ends our obligation to dreamers. This is the latest example of Republicans putting Trump's anti-immigrant demands above moral decency, families, dreamers, and the will of the American people. It is indefensible and immoral that this House continues to derail bipartisan efforts to protect dreamers. The antics that we are witnessing are why the American people have lost faith that their representatives can find bipartisan solutions to our nation's most pressing issues. But as a member of Congress in the minority party, at a time of deep political division and instability, I still believe it's possible for us to work together to improve the well-being of families, children, and young people. And that's why I'm imploring you to join me in voting for the Bipartisan Dream Act that upholds our values and fulfills our promise to protect dreamers and their families. I yield back.
He yields back. For what purposes, gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I claim time in opposition to the motion to recommit.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this effort to distract us from the major problems that we're attempting to address in our country. This motion to recommit only deals with amnesty for a far larger population of people than the American people expect to have addressed. The people that are the DACA recipients or people who arrived here as young children before June 15, 2007. This bill does nothing to solve the problem with the surge of people at the border of our country. It does nothing to create new border security, wall and fencing systems, technology, personnel that are needed, judges in courtrooms to process the huge number, the 600,000 backlog of amnesty cases that we have. This does nothing to close the loopholes that are allowing people to enjoy what's called catch and release, where they come into the country, some of them even turn themselves in knowing that ultimately they're going to be released into the interior of the United States. We need to give the administration the tools they need to stop this problem, and it's not a new problem. The Obama administration wanted a number of the changes that are in this bill with regard to clarifying things like the terrible Flores decision, which is at the heart of the problem we have with young children being separated from their parents. We fixed those things in this legislation, and yet this would substitute all of that for something that is just targeted at what the other party wants to do. And they call upon us to work in a bipartisan fashion. This bill addresses all of the areas that need to be addressed, and they give lip service to the other areas, but they do not address them. And this is proof of that by the fact that it only deals with amnesty. We need to have a movement to a merit-based immigration system. We need to end the terrible visa lottery system, which is a national security problem and which is something that does not benefit the American economy. We need to move from chain migration to a merit-based system. And we need to make sure that we treat the DACA recipients better than they're treated under the unconstitutional illegal Obama process, but not at the cost of not doing the other three pillars that we are seeking to address. We need to address the border security and interior enforcement. We need to end the visa lottery and move to a merit-based system. We need to end chain migration. It also doesn't have anything about E-Verify or helping 1 million agricultural guest workers who want to work in this country legally and the farmers who want to have a system that allows them to do that legally. This is the bill that we need to pass, not this motion to recommit. I urge my colleagues to oppose the motion to recommit and support the underlying legislation.
This gentleman yield back. Without objection, the previous question is ordered on the motion to recommit. The question is on the motion. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The noes have it. The motion is not.
I ask for the ayes and nays.
The ayes and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the ayes and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the ayes and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, the chair will reduce to 5 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote on the question of the passage of the bill. This is a 15-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 191 and the nays are 234. The motion is not adopted. The question is on the passage of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The bill is passed.
And then I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. Sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 193 and the nays are 231. The bill is not passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.